In Part 1, we exposed the weapons, spiked clubs, sharpened shovels, brass knuckle knives, tools that looked medieval but were carried into the most industrial war in history. Now you're going inside the 20-minute soldiers called certain death. The preparation. The crawl across no man's land. The silent drop into an enemy trench. What happened next was fast, brutal, and over before most men understood they were under attack. No artillery barrage. No warning. No mercy. This is what trench raiding really looked like when the clock started ticking, and survival meant getting out before the entire enemy line woke up. Preparation for a raid began days or even weeks in advance, depending on the scale and objectives. Scout patrols went out into no man's land on multiple nights to map the exact layout of enemy wire, locate listening posts, identify the best approach routes, and determine where enemy sentries were positioned and when they changed shifts. Meanwhile, the raiding party itself trained extensively, sometimes using mock-ups of the target trench system built behind friendly lines so soldiers could practice the exact movements they would need to execute in darkness under combat conditions. On the night of the raid, raiders stripped off all identifying insignia and anything that could make noise. Metal buttons were taped over, identification tags were left behind. Anything that rattled was secured or removed entirely. Faces were blackened with burnt cork or brown grease made from mixing oil with dirt. Thick rubber gloves protected hands from barbed wire and made it possible to handle the wire silently without leather or cloth gloves catching and tearing. Every raider carried those weapons we discussed: clubs, knives, sharpened shovels, along with grenades for when silence no longer mattered, and pistols as backup weapons. Operations were timed strictly, usually to a maximum of 20 minutes from the moment raiders entered the enemy trench to the moment they began withdrawal, because 20 minutes was roughly how long it took for enemy reinforcements to be roused, organized, and sent forward to the threatened sector. Stay longer than 20 minutes, and you were trapped. Crossing no man's land was the first test, and it killed plenty of raiders before they ever reached the enemy line. The distance varied wildly depending on the sector. In some places, enemy trenches were separated by 300 yards or more of open ground, while in other locations the lines were so close that you could hear enemy soldiers talking, and the distance was measured in dozens of feet rather than hundreds. The terrain itself was a nightmare. No man's land was cratered by artillery, turned into a morass of mud by rain and poor drainage, littered with debris ranging from abandoned equipment to the corpses of men from previous actions that nobody had been able to recover. Barbed wire stretched across much of the space in overlapping belts, sometimes 30 feet deep and 5 or 6 feet tall, anchored by iron stakes and consisting of strand after strand of wire with sharpened barbs every few inches. Some wire obstacles had empty tin cans hung on them that would rattle if touched, providing audible warning to alert sentries. Raiders moved on their bellies, crawling forward inches at a time, taking hours to cover distances that could be walked in minutes. One veteran described the key quality as patience. If you moved slowly enough and stayed flat to the ground, you were nearly invisible and inaudible in darkness. Wire-cutting parties sometimes went out on previous nights to cut paths through the obstacles, but this was risky because enemy patrols might discover the cut wire and realize a raid was coming. At any moment during the crossing, the terrifying possibility of illumination hung over everything. Both sides used star shells, artillery rounds that burst at height and released a magnesium flare suspended from a small parachute, blazing so brightly that no man's land was lit up like midday for a full minute or more. The Germans also used pistol flares that provided 10 to 15 seconds of intense light. The instant a flare ignited overhead, raiders froze completely, not daring to move a muscle until the light died. Any movement visible in that glare brought immediate machine gun fire sweeping across the area. Veterans learned to keep their heads down and eyes closed when flares went up, because if you watched the light, your eyes would reflect it slightly, and sentries scanning the darkness with binoculars would spot that reflection and know exactly where you were. Then there were the sentries and listening posts to deal with. Both sides maintained positions out in no man's land itself, in front of the main trench lines, specifically to detect enemy approach. These were usually shell holes or small excavated positions where 2 or 3 soldiers would spend the night listening for any sound of movement, ready to fire signal flares or retreat to the main line to raise the alarm if they detected anything suspicious. Raiders had to locate these posts and either avoid them entirely, which wasn't always possible, or silence them before the alarm could be raised. The standard technique was to crawl close enough to identify the position, wait for the right moment, then rush the final few yards and kill the sentries as quietly as possible, using knives or clubs before they could fire weapons or signal for help. This was brutal, intimate work that required raiders to get close enough to see their enemies' faces in the darkness before killing them. Enemy patrols were another danger because both sides sent men into no man's land for reconnaissance, so there was always the possibility that a raiding party would encounter an enemy patrol doing essentially the same thing from the opposite direction. These chance meetings in the darkness sometimes turned into desperate hand-to-hand combat in the mud and shell craters, with neither side entirely sure who they were fighting or how many enemies they faced. Raiders and enemy patrols both learned that when one side of the line went completely quiet, no shots fired, no flares sent up, it usually meant a patrol was out, because you didn't want to illuminate your own men or hit them with random fire. Occasionally, when opposing patrols met by chance, both sides would simply let each other pass without fighting, a mutual acknowledgement that starting a firefight would bring down fire from both trench lines and nobody would make it back alive. But that required recognition and mutual understanding in the darkness, which wasn't always possible, and plenty of these encounters ended with everyone involved dead in the mud. Once raiders actually reached the enemy trench and dropped inside, everything accelerated to chaotic violence. The first few seconds were critical. Sentries had to be killed immediately and silently if possible to prevent them from raising the alarm. Then raiders moved through the trench system, using the same zigzag layout that protected defenders from artillery to now provide raiders with cover as they advanced from bay to bay. Grenades were thrown into dugouts where enemy soldiers slept or sheltered. Clubs and knives were used to kill anyone encountered in the narrow confines of the trench. Machine gun positions were wrecked by smashing the mechanisms or throwing grenades into the emplacements. Communications wires were cut. And if the objective was prisoner capture, raiders had to identify and grab specific targets, usually junior officers or NCOs, who would have useful intelligence, and drag them back toward friendly lines while the man fought and resisted and tried to raise alarm. The sound of combat in the trenches was described by survivors as a kind of terrible symphony, the dull thud of clubs hitting flesh and bone, the metallic ring of sharpened shovels striking helmets. The screams of wounded men, the flat crack of pistol shots in confined spaces, the louder crump of grenades exploding in dugouts. And beneath it all, the desperate shouting and confusion of men trying to figure out what was happening and where the attack was coming from. Every second inside the enemy trench was a second closer to disaster, because German or British or French soldiers in the neighboring sections of trench were being roused by the noise, grabbing weapons, and running toward the fight. The 20-minute clock was running, and it was unforgiving. The withdrawal was almost always the most dangerous part of the entire operation. Raiders were now moving quickly rather than carefully, possibly dragging unwilling prisoners or carrying wounded comrades, and subtlety was no longer possible. Enemy soldiers were now fully alert and shooting at anything that moved. Machine guns traversed across no man's land, firing on predicted paths that raiders might use. Artillery began dropping shells across the area, sometimes blindly, sometimes guided by observers who had spotted movement. Flares went up constantly, eliminating any possibility of concealment. In all that chaos, with adrenaline running high and visibility nearly zero, raiders sometimes became disoriented and lost their sense of direction. More than one raiding party made it back to a trench line with a sense of relief, only to realize, with dawning horror, that they had somehow circled back to the enemy trench they had just attacked, where the soldiers inside were very much awake now and not at all friendly. And even if you made it back to your own lines, there was the final danger of friendly fire. The sentries in your trench knew a raid was out, but in the confusion of darkness and incoming fire, it was easy for frightened men to shoot at shapes coming over the parapet toward them. Password systems were established, so returning raiders could identify themselves when challenged. But sometimes the sentry had been relieved during the raid, and the replacement didn't know the password, or didn't hear it correctly over the noise, or panicked and fired anyway. Soldiers died within 10 feet of safety, shot by their own side, after surviving everything else the night had thrown at them. All of this effort, all of this death and risk and brutality was often for objectives that seemed trivial or even pointless to the men who actually carried them out. High command, sitting in comfortable headquarters 30 miles from the front, wanted intelligence about enemy positions and unit identifications, so they ordered raids to capture prisoners who could be interrogated. The soldiers who went over the top to get those prisoners understood that the information gained was rarely worth the casualties suffered, but orders were orders, and refusing to go meant execution for cowardice. Many raiding operations were never officially recorded because the men sent out simply never came back, and after a few days of waiting, it was assumed they were dead, and the operation was quietly forgotten. And even when raids succeeded with minimal casualties, they almost inevitably brought retaliation. The enemy would conduct their own raid the following night or the night after that, and the cycle of violence would continue, each side raiding the other in an endless exchange that accomplished nothing except to fill graveyards and break the men who survived. Yet despite the brutality and the questionable military value, trench raiding taught armies something crucial about modern warfare. And that lesson would eventually break the stalemate in ways that neither side fully anticipated. The tactics and weapons that emerged from raiding operations began to influence thinking about offensive operations on a larger scale. While small-scale raiding proved useful for gathering intelligence and keeping troops aggressive, military planners on both sides began asking whether these same principles, speed, surprise, close-quarters violence, bypassing strong points rather than attacking them directly, could be applied to breaking the defensive stalemate on a much larger scale. The Germans were the first to seriously attempt this transformation, creating purpose-built assault units that eventually became known as Stormtroopers, or Stormtroopers, trained specifically to exploit the lessons learned from years of trench raiding. The concept was revolutionary in the context of 1917 and 1918. Instead of attacking along the entire width of a sector, which was the standard approach that had failed so catastrophically at places like the Somme and Verdun, Stormtroopers would identify weak points in the enemy line and concentrate overwhelming force on those specific locations. They would bypass strong points entirely, leaving them for follow-up waves to deal with, and push deep into the enemy rear area to disrupt artillery positions, command posts, and supply lines. The idea was to create chaos and confusion rather than simply to seize and hold ground, to cut front-line troops off from their headquarters and logistics, and let the entire defensive system collapse from within. This required a complete change in how commanders thought about tactics and training. Junior officers and NCOs were encouraged to exercise personal initiative and make decisions on the ground rather than waiting for orders from higher headquarters, because speed and adaptability were more valuable than rigid adherence to pre-planned operations. Stormtroopers were elite volunteers, typically men under 25 with athletic backgrounds and high levels of physical fitness. They carried significantly more firepower than standard infantry. Satchels full of grenades were standard equipment. When the MP-18 submachine gun became available in 1918, Stormtroopers received priority allocation because the weapon was perfect for close-quarters fighting in trenches. They used Luger pistols, modified with 32-round drum magazines and detachable shoulder stocks that converted the pistols into short carbines. They had flamethrowers for clearing bunkers and dugouts. They carried a lightened version of the MG-8 machine gun that could be manhandled forward during an assault rather than remaining in fixed positions. And despite all this modern firepower, they still carried trench clubs, knives, and sharpened shovels because everyone understood that when you got inside enemy trenches, the fighting would come down to those weapons just as it had during night raids. The effectiveness of these tactics was dramatically demonstrated at the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917, where German stormtrooper units supporting an Austrian offensive achieved one of the most lopsided victories of the entire war. The attack captured 265,000 Italian prisoners and advanced over 60 miles toward Venice before logistical constraints finally halted the advance. One of the stormtrooper commanders at Caporetto was a 26-year-old officer named Erwin Rommel, who would later become one of the most famous German generals of the Second World War. With just 150 men under his command, Rommel captured 1,500 Italian prisoners in a single action by finding concealed mountain paths through Italian positions and attacking from directions the defenders never anticipated. Caporetto demonstrated what stormtrooper tactics could achieve when applied with proper planning and adequate resources. But Germany's real target was always the Western Front. And in March 1918, they finally got their chance to prove the concept against British and French forces. When Germany concluded its war with Russia and signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, nearly 50 divisions were freed up from the Eastern Front and transferred west. For the first time since 1914, Germany actually outnumbered the Allies on the Western Front, and this was their window to win the war before American troops arrived in overwhelming numbers. The Spring Offensive, launched on March 21, 1918, began with the largest artillery barrage of the entire war, over 1 million shells fired in just 5 hours, targeting not just frontline positions but also communication lines, headquarters locations, and artillery positions deep in the rear. Dense fog on the morning of the attack allowed stormtroopers to advance deep into British positions without being spotted until they were already inside the defensive lines. The German advance in the first 2 weeks was extraordinary by Western Front standards. They pushed forward 40 miles, the deepest penetration since the War of Movement in 1914, and for the first time in years, it looked like the stalemate might actually be broken by offensive action. British headquarters genuinely considered the possibility of evacuation and retreat to the Channel ports. German success seemed, for a brief moment, to validate everything the stormtrooper concept promised. But the offensive had a fatal flaw built into its success, and that flaw was logistics. Stormtroopers were trained to move fast and strike hard, advancing so quickly that they outran their own artillery support. Supply lines across the devastated landscape created by years of artillery bombardment simply couldn't keep up with the pace of advance. The best soldiers had been pulled from regular units and concentrated into elite stormtrooper formations, and these men suffered disproportionately high casualties in the constant fighting that couldn't be replaced because the pool of trained men was finite. By summer, the offensive had stalled. The Allies, reinforced by fresh American divisions, launched a counteroffensive on August 8, 1918, a date that German General Ludendorff later described as the Black Day of the German Army. Over 400 tanks supported the attack, and the scale of combined arms, coordination infantry, armor, artillery, and aircraft all working together represented everything that modern industrial warfare could achieve when properly organized. By autumn, over 100,000 German prisoners had been captured. German lines were collapsing across multiple sectors, and the armistice came on November 11th, ending the war, but not the influence of what trench raiders and stormtroopers had proven about future warfare. The lessons learned in those 20 minutes of terror in dark trenches influenced military thinking for decades. Small unit tactics, aggressive infiltration, bypassing strong points, close quarters weapons designed for urban and confined fighting, all of these became standard elements of infantry doctrine in armies around the world. The Second World War would see these tactics refined and expanded. Modern special operations forces still study the raids conducted by Canadian and German units in World War I because the fundamental principles haven't changed. Get in fast, hit hard, accomplish specific objectives, and get out before the enemy can respond in force. The weapons have changed, and the technology is vastly superior, but the core concept remains identical to what soldiers figured out in the mud and darkness of the Western Front over a century ago. Europe in 1914 was the most technologically advanced civilization in human history, the pinnacle of industrial achievement, a society that genuinely believed it had left medieval barbarism behind forever. And yet, within months of the war beginning, that same civilization had regressed to a form of combat that would have been instantly recognizable to warriors from 500 years earlier. Despite all the artillery and machine guns, despite the airplanes and submarines, and tanks and poison gas, despite every technological advantage that modernity could provide, the war ultimately came down to men with clubs and sharpened shovels killing each other in the darkness, face to face, close enough to see each other's eyes in those final moments. That is what those 20 minutes of terror in the trenches revealed about human nature and about war itself. Technology changes, weapons evolve. But combat, at its core, remains what it has always been: violent, personal, and utterly unforgiving of mistakes. The men who went over the parapet into no man's land, who crawled across mud and wire and corpses to drop into enemy trenches, armed with nothing but medieval weapons and 20 minutes to accomplish their mission before everything exploded into chaos. Those men understood something that modern warfare tries to obscure with precision munitions and drone strikes and surgical strikes conducted from thousands of miles away. They understood that war, stripped of all its technological sophistication and strategic complexity, is ultimately about human beings killing other human beings at close range, and that no amount of civilization or progress or industrial development changes that fundamental reality. The 20 minutes of terror that trench raiders endured didn't just change World War I. They exposed a truth about warfare that remains uncomfortable and undeniable more than a century later.